When you get to that place where your hand is like right in front of your face and you're like, damn, if I could only find my hand right now, I'd be really good. This mix would be great. You got to get up out of the chair and walk away. You get to that place where you just like wound yourself into this, rabbit hole. But for the most part, if you really trust your ears, when someone says, hey, is the mix done? It's when I can close my eyes and it sounds like music.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Today's episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is sponsored by Roswell Pro Audio, maker of handcrafted microphones in California. Inspired design and impeccable attention to detail will help you capture a gorgeous vintage sound without the vintage price tag. Check out their beautiful line of microphones at roswellproaudio.com. You may already know that using true analog gear is one of the best ways to create a great record. Yet increasingly, we live in a digital world, recording and mixing inside the computer. So what if you could have the best of both worlds? Tegeler Audio Manufaktur is bridging the analog-digital divide by creating high-end analog gear like the Schwerkraftmaschine compressor and the Raumzeitmaschine reverb, whose knobs you can control remotely using a plug-in in your DAW. Or their many analog units like the Cream bus compressor with mastering EQ, or the Veritube recording channel that let you save your settings using a custom recall sheet plugin, offering a complete line of pro audio gear from compressors to EQs to reverbs and beyond. Now you can get a pro analog sound while benefiting from the power of digital. Let your DAW help you move your knobs so that your music can move you. Click the link in the show notes to learn more about Tegeler Audio Manufaktur. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Ross Hogarth, a multiple Grammy-winning producer, engineer, and mixer with a long and varied list of credits in musical styles from blues to reggae, heavy metal to rock. Gov't Mule, Roger Waters, the Black Crowes, Shawn Colvin, John Mellencamp, R.E.M.and Jewel are just some of the artists that Ross has worked with in over 3 decades of recording. Growing up in New York during the influential punk scene of the 70s, making his way to San Francisco's exploding new wave scene and Southern California's seminal rock scene, Ross evolved from doing live production and sound on the road with Jackson Browne, David Lindley, Fleetwood Mac and Little into producing, engineering, and mixing Grammy-winning artists in the studio. And in 1986, Ross established Hoax Productions to have the freedom to promote and produce top names as well as newly discovered talent. Refusing to let himself be pigeonholed in any one particular musical genre, his studio work runs the gamut from heavy metal insanity of Motley Crue and Coal Chamber to the Grammy-winning Keb' Mo' release Slow Down to recent releases by Van Halen, Grammy-winning Ziggy Marley, and the Sick Puppies. I'm psyched to be able to talk about making great records with you, Ross, whether producing, tracking, or mixing in the studio. Please welcome Ross Hogarth to Recording Studio Rockstars. Ross, are you ready to rock?
I'm ready to rock. Let's rock.
How does that feel to have me read this long-winded intro and you're just holding your breath and waiting for me to finish up already?
It's funny because I always think of myself as what I'm doing, not what I've done, so.
Good advice.
I just don't wear my discography on my sleeve. So when you read it off, I'm like listening to you going, well, who is that guy?
That'd be a hell of a t-shirt if you had your own, discography tour t-shirt.
Okay.
Well, groovy, man. So, I kind of touched on a little bit of your musical path and journey there, but maybe tell us in your own words briefly how you got started out in recording and how'd you get into all this stuff? I think you started in songwriting and all, right?
Yeah. I came up in my world, and grew up in New York. I'm the son of the famous artist Vern Hogarth, who was the original illustrator of Tarzan, and my mother, Connie, who is still alive, and she's in her 90s, and she's a super lefty liberal. our best friends were Pete Seeger. So I grew up playing originally drums and also then stringed instruments and being around the scene of people playing mando and banjo. And
was this up near Newburgh, New York? That like that part of it?
My mother lives in Beacon. I grew up in the city and then just outside of the city. And then she moved up to Beacon like 40 years ago to be closer to the Seegers, Pete and Toshi Seeger and that whole scene. So yeah, Beacon, the home of Pete, and it's the Newburgh Beacon Bridge. And,
that's where my mom ended up for a while too. And she was talking about I think there was actually a sailboat called Pete Seeger too there that would sail on the river there.
It's called the Clearwater and the Hudson River Sloop, and it was created back in the late 60s to go up and down the Hudson River, and it actually created it stopped a lot of companies dumping into the water, and it was an awareness thing. And yeah, I worked on that when I was a kid. And
oh, cool.
So there was that mix between like organic and then punk. Yeah, I wrote music and played in bands, and was like the guitar player that was always doing the sound and always interested in recording and doing the demos. And so for my passion started very young. And but I had a epiphany as a teenager that I'd be, my 40s or 50s in a crushed velvet suit playing in like the Midwest.
Nice.
And it freaked me out. I'd be like in a cover band and playing in the Midwest. And in my mind, I always wanted to work with the greatest musicians ever. And I knew at a young age that wasn't actually going to happen as a musician, that it was going to have to happen some other way. So I think that's what drove me from actually being the writer performer. I mean, throughout my career, I've played on records, I play percussion, I play guitar, but I decided to go into the service side of things. Like, I believe that what we do as producer, engineers, and mixers is serve we serve the musicians, we serve the song, we serve the project. So you have to be willing to be like cool with service, or else you'll never really be very good at what we do,
That was something that I remember Steve Albini saying to me when we worked together. He just pointed out, he's like, we're in a service industry here. And it was kind of an eye-opener for me at that time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I always like use an analogy similar to that of like going to like one of the finest restaurants, having a really great waiter, and you never like look down to see if your glass of water is filled or whatever, but he's sort of invisible, but he's been there because things are always taken care of.
I remember that when I started out, I was probably one of the shittiest waiters you could ever hope to have. And years later, after actually eating in restaurants, I had this sense, I might make a much better waiter today because I actually understand what it's like to eat in a restaurant. Do you feel like you've experienced any of that analogy in terms of recording and being in the studio?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the one amazing thing about this gig is that we can kind of always be a work in progress. Like, once you actually think something, you're going to get yourself in trouble because like whatever worked on the last project may not work on this project, particularly technically. And then, with people are, everybody's different, so kind of like you keep culling a people skill, to be able to morph and handle and deal with the different personalities, whether it be the manager or the artist or the guitar tech, who is actually the guy that's the closest guy to the guitar player, and then he's the spy. I'm not getting like covert, right. You never know. So you kind of have to always.
The muffins are coming out of the oven there. I can hear it.
Oh yeah, sorry. That I can't stop. That's like a text, and I can't seem to turn. I don't know if I can't turn off.
Quite all right, Rockstars. It's just another indication of how Ross is in the moment. We're not looking back. We're here now, and everybody's.
Yeah.
You're busy man. So thank you again for taking time out to do the interview with us too.
Oh, I appreciate it. No, it's always fun to do these because. So that's my thing was getting on the road, taking care of musicians, learning all the facets of basically making records by watching them be made with the artists that I was the guitar tech, or like I worked with a lot of different people, David Lindley being one of the top of the mentor lists, Bry Cooter, Bonnie Raitt.
What a great player. Oddly, my introduction to David Lindley was a little bit late. It was a record he did of Madagascar music in the 90s. I don't know if you would remember that one.
Yeah, no, Henry Kaiser, the two of them. Malagasy music, I'm a big fan of because that's
maybe introduce us to who David Lindley is to the rock stars, just sort of who may not know anything about him.
Well, David Lindley came up winning the Topanga Canyon banjo and fiddle contest here in the late 60s. He connected with Jackson Browne and then was Jackson's multi-instrumentalist on most of Jackson's records from the second. The first record had Jesse Ed Davis, and then the second record that he made called For Every Man, which had Take It Easy and a bunch of hits. Since David was a fiddle player and a slot, he's known for his lap steel, and his lap steel melody on Running on Empty kind of is the melody of that song. And David was his secret weapon, and played fiddle and lap steel and guitar. And he was, became very much part of the LA session scene, playing on Crosby and Nash records, and Lindley is very much in the LA scene or in the session scene, super appreciated. I think underappreciated overall for people that don't really know him, but once they get to know him, his slide guitar playing is virtuoso level playing, and so I was fortunate to be his guitar tech, and he plays a lot. He plays a lot of really quirky instruments like electric saws and bouzouki, and tuning his instruments and bringing his pawn shop of guitars around. He was like the first pawn shop guitar guy, like Silvertones, Dan Electros, Tyscos.
Right. You had to keep those all tuned up and in tip-top shape.
Yeah, really quirky instruments with weird bridges. And so I became, and that was that kind of, again, going into service, like that whole concept of like, doesn't matter what you're doing on any given day, just do it the best you can possibly do it and be really good at it. And that leads you somewhere you're not sure where you're going to get to, but it'll lead you somewhere, So that was sort of my deal. And Dumble amplifiers, helping Alexander Howard Dumble in his shop build amplifiers, learning about, mil-spec values of caps and, resistors, and learning tone through iron and tube choices, and really a lot of stuff that's like underneath the hood kind of thing that has helped me throughout my career.
Yeah, well, amp stuff gets really deep.
It does. And tone, like where your tone gets to, which led me and leads me continually through my career, because I really believe in like trying to make the sounds also inspire the musicians to play their best, and it's a paradox in that respect. You can have a great musician, but if you don't get a great sound from him, then he doesn't get inspired and he won't play his best.
If you don't mind, I'll segue off that just to reference something else I noticed in your biography. You had gotten from Dave Pensato an award for best tracking engineer. I believe that was sort of one of the accolades they shared with you. And listening to a variety of your records, I feel like I could really hear that, like there was a real respect for all the instruments and a real clarity in all the sounds. And I imagine that what you're describing, this service mentality and understanding how to get great tones out of stuff, maybe naturally, transitioned into becoming a wonderful tracking engineer.
I appreciate that. And I actually was really flattered to win I actually won the first Pensados at the first Pensado. So, the first award they gave was tracking at the first award. So it was interesting to be sitting there at that first award for them and have it, and I do believe that, coming up as a drummer and then playing all these instruments, and then, because I played French horn, I learned piano, and then being a roadie and, tuning all the instruments and being on the road and learning that at the source, kind of what got me in the studio was being in the studio on a Lindley recording where, I would go out in the room and make sure his amp sounded right. And then I go back in the control room and I'd sit in the back of the room, and the engineer at the time was having a hard time getting his tone for whatever reason. And finally Lindley got kind of irritated and he threw me at the desk. And
oh man, I bet there was no tension there in that moment.
No, it was a weird, tense kind of moment because I was not an engineer. At that point in time, at least in my own, vernacular of, now I have a different attitude about that. I believe that you say what you are and then you go do what you do to become, like if at the time I actually just said I was an engineer, I would have been probably a little quicker to get to the source. But of being an engineer, because I really do believe you have to be what it is before you actually do it. Like, oh, I'm going to be successful. Okay, well then I'm going to do success. Anyway, so I was thrown in the chair and I realized very quickly that being an engineer meant having a great source and then having it translate out of the speakers. And if you couldn't get it to translate, it was like on the engineer. It's on me at that point, because I went back out in the room. I'm like, okay, this is, all right, where's the mic placed? All right, now, and I learned very quickly that moving a microphone a quarter of an inch or a half an inch makes a huge difference, like a huge difference on a lot of things. So I just learned that really early on, that if it wasn't coming out of the speakers, it was time to get up out of the chair and go out in the room. A lot of engineers never even leave their chair. They just sit there and they have their assistants go run out and move their mics around and stuff. And I believe you have to actually see where the microphone's pointed, so and sometimes it's about changing the microphone, too. So there's so many little details that if you just ignore all that and you just sit in the chair and think something's going to change by twisting a bunch of EQ, usually it isn't going to get better,
Yeah. No, mic placement is such a massive thing. And I find that one of the things that's a little frustrating as you're sort of developing your engineering ability at mic placement is that there's always this delay, on the feedback where you have to go out and move something, then come back in and have somebody play, listen, see what it sounds like. Do you have any advice about how to get the most out of that process and not feel like you're just guessing in the dark?
Well, one of the things I did a few years ago for Royer was to do a mic placement on guitar amps of a blend between a 57 and a Royer, things like that. I've tried to make educational as some very specific, like if this is where you place a 57 or you place a Royer, so that's some very specific stuff. But in the more general sense, sounds always have to work inside of the track with other sounds. So, the first thing as an engineer is you have to know kind of what you're doing. If I'm working on a rock song with a crash ride and the drummer is going to be smashing away at that crash ride, but I don't get the drum sound with the same crash ride against, the guitars, you never really know how it's going to work. So you kind of have to have, often when you're doing the way that a lot of guys work these days, kind of, in a cottage industry where the drummer plays and the bass player plays, a lot of recordings then are just not going to be great because the drummer's not even playing to the guitars that are even resembling whatever the guitars are going to be. And it's like building a house, for me, I look at this whole construction of a track from a very much a carpenter's standpoint. Like one of the reasons I feel like I work in a lot of different genres, not only am I a huge fan of almost all styles of music, give or take some I just don't dig, but or just don't feel like that's my bag. Even though I listen to hip hop, like, Run the Jewels, Kendrick Lamar, Brockhampton, I'm really a fan of some of the new stuff. I don't feel like that's really something that I yet have a handle on. I'm not really making hip hop records, but most other styles, I believe I can be a really fine carpenter and hang a square cabinet at, so,
nice.
So in that analogy, I believe that you have to understand like what kind of music you're working in and how it relates and how it all relates together. And a lot of people make records just by soloing stuff up and not really understanding that it's a whole big picture in the end.
Yeah. Well, I'd always talked about the process of recording in the studio and one overdub at a time is sort of like trying to build a house one brick at a time, and then you get to the end and you hope it looks like a house when you're done, which of course is a silly analogy because I don't know how else you build a house except for one brick at a time. But the idea that when you record a group of musicians together tracking, there's that whole response and everything's in shift and change to each other. And if you try and do one thing at a time, the drums and there's no guitars, then what's the drummer playing to? But if it's guitars and there's no drums, what's the guitar player playing to?
Yeah,
so I understand what you mean.
Some of the one of the things that I have gotten better at, as far as in my career, because of the way that records are being made, I feel like I'm a better mix engineer now because I never considered myself a mix engineer per se, because I just consider myself an engineer or producer engineer or whatever, because I always felt that when I made a record, a lot of records I made, I mixed those records early on because we were just making the record, and it wasn't like there was such a thing as a mix engineer. Right. And that became something that, the Lord Alges and Clear Mountain, Michael Brower, some of these guys that were doing this very early on were just known as mix engineers, even though I know Chris records. Tom doesn't really record very much, I think, or ever anymore. I don't think Brower really records much. A lot of guys don't record at all. I've always considered myself someone who, because I was in on the ground level of projects, I would just end up mixing them because that's what we did. We made records. And so that was something that I feel like because of the way that records are being made and I make some records, people like them or whatever, and then they want me to mix their record. And then I get this record that's really not very well recorded. Now I've got to shine it up, or to not be so kind, turd polish, as we have said,
They said, I remember learning that idea in school. They say, you can only polish a turd so much before you just get shit everywhere.
Yeah. And sometimes you just have to be okay with the fact that, it's just not going to sound as great as, you could make it and that's kind of part of surrendering, learning, as I get older, I learn, I think, to surrender more. I learned surrender is really okay. It's not the white flag that I used to think it was. But, yeah, I really do believe that some of the best records I make are ones that they've already have they're already on their way to being mixed as I'm recording them. Mm-hmm. Because I'm thinking of this house I'm building from the get-go.
Well, so I will jump to another question I had for you about mixing, just see what you want to comment on. One of the things I felt like I was picking up on too was sort of a respect for the kind of left center LCR or, left, right, center approach to mixing. And I wondered if you wanted to share any thoughts about the importance of panning in mixes and why that stuff is important.
Yeah, panning is super, super crucial to me. I always, before I ever even EQ anything or even compress anything, one of the first things I'll do when I'm mixing anything is, and this goes to my recording when I'm producing, is I got to make sure that I am placing the instruments that are in that song where they're supposed to be before I do anything. And I do live very much inside of an LCR concept, left, center, right. And then I pick very specifically the in-between, what's going to live in between, that might need to be the thing that really shows up, not left, center, or right. And then it really shows itself to be in that space. Mm-hmm. I think some of this comes from my upbringing as a son of an artist. My father was fortunate in his having, illustrated Tarzan and also being a master educator of art anatomy and art history. He started the School of Visual Arts in New York and was also sent around the world to promote some of the Tarzan stuff. And so he was he would manipulate the the trip to be able to take the family. And so I was fortunate to be, walked through many amazing museums by my father, and he was an amazing educator. And so he'd put me in front of pictures and explain what was going on. At the time, I mildly might have been somewhat like, would rather have been like going to see like Yankees baseball or something instead of, but as you get older and you appreciate the gifts that you were given or you got by osmosis, sort of. And one of the things when I mix is I don't just think of left, center, right. I think of front and back. Mm-hmm. What's in the foreground, what's in the midground, what's in behind the mix. So for me, it's very much using dimension and and that's in sometimes my recording and using rooms and, using room mics and also just not having everything stereo, reverbs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so trying to create some dimension. So I find if everything is stereo or everything is mono, there's this, sense of lack of dimension. But the thing about LCR, it really does work. Like when you place something at 70% or, whatever percent, it really does live in that space when there's nothing competing with it there. So, like with this Gov't Mule record that I was fortunate to be nominated for Best Engineer a few years ago, we didn't win the Grammy on, we were nominated for a bunch of Grammys on Blues Americana. But on that record, Gov't Mule we have on some songs, there's mandolins and acoustics and tambos and shakers and backgrounds and horns and all sorts of stuff going on, and so to place all that stuff in there, you really have to pick your panning wisely.
Pick your panning.
Yeah.
There's a catchphrase to remember. Well, so let me segue off that and ask you a couple of thoughts about, for example, let's say you have a guitar coming out of a guitar amp. What are some ways that you might have that guitar live on the left side of the mix versus giving it depth and pushing it towards the back of the mix?
Well, for one thing I always do just for guitar recordists, I don't record my Royer 57 to 2 tracks. I always put them on 1 track, so there's 1 track of guitar. But often I like a room mic, but that room mic will get panned sometimes off like about 60 or 70% to the right if the original sound's on the left. And it makes that, because what happens with room mics is they tend to have a sort of a pre-delay, there's a bounce to them. And if I'm not using a room mic because the room just doesn't have something to give, then I'll pan a delay or a reverb or something a little bit off to bounce it to the other direction, which the dry is going to hold very hard left, but the sound will move a bit to the right a little bit and create a dimension. Mm-hmm. And then often if you really want, like say, the guitar player has got a pile of pedals, but it just doesn't really sound very musical coming out of the amp with all his pedals, but you kind of want that sense of that. I may like actually print those pedals after on a take, or know what those pedals are and have some sense of what that effect is, whether it's tremolo or reverb, some kind of thing. And it may not live right on top of the sound. It wants to live a little bit off the sound, which creates a dimension where you have dry and then you have your reverb. So, as like a tip, I would just say don't always have your reverb in stereo. Don't have your reverb right on top of the dry side. Have it be a mono signal or maybe a stereo signal that's like one bit of it is like maybe hard right, but the other part of it is like 70%, so it's sort of over there on the other side, and you get it to blend so that you still have your dry being dry and have that immediacy, but still have a dimension that doesn't just make your sound just kind of disappear into the mix when it's right on top of it.
Yeah, that's cool. I think that's great advice, and I think that I understand what you're saying. So that if you have the dry amp, that gives you this presence and detail of something sort of up close near your speaker, but it's the way you're panning off these other elements that make that not feel so plain and just sitting there. It gives it depth and space.
I use the word pasty, like when everything's totally dry on your mix. Even though like there are records that we are super, super fond of because they sound dry, I know those are not dry. Like, for example, God rest his soul, Tom Petty, my mastering engineer, Richard Dodd, down there in Your World in Nashville is amazing. But he made those, some of those Petty records and Wilbury's records. There actually is a lot going on those records, but they show up as dry, but they're not pasty and like boxy and dry. They're just dimensional, but feel dry, immediate, Yeah,
well, he talked about working with Rick Rubin and sort of finding that balance of those two things too, because apparently Rick would, really request just bone dry everything. But I think, as I recall, Richard would do what you were describing, which is find a way to give it that quality, but also still have this depth. What do you feel like are some ways to have the instruments and the sounds, maybe vocals included, kind of bone dry and all up in your face, but not really dry, still have this subtle depth to it?
Well, one of the things that I rarely ever do is actually add reverb to drums. And if I do use reverb on drums, it's only on the snare drum, and it'll be super short to just give the snare maybe a little more depth, or sometimes drop it in pitch, because an actual nonlinear reverb can actually drop the pitch of a snare without sounding like the 80s, where the amount of it made it sound like the 80s.
Right.
But that's a trick that I've been doing since the 80s using AMS non-lin. But when the drums have space on them, but that is not reverb, but is like the sound of a punchy room, that's already like, in the cooking analogy, like when you're making gumbo, like your roux, or,
I'm a huge fan of gumbo, by the way.
So you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to make it. I just know how to eat it.
But how that base is for the rice and for everything to sit on is, crucial. Like soup, too much cornstarch, it gets really thick and awful. But you got to have just enough, So any of those analogies of like because everything lays on top of those drums for the most part, unless you're just doing total singer-songwriter music, which is just like a vocal and acoustic or whatever. So it's really crucial how you build your drum sound, because everything else that goes on top of it is going to be, sort of how it lays. So I tend to like a fair amount of natural ambience, but not like super like long, I like it. I do, but that'll immediately allow your guitars to sometimes be completely dry, but recorded with ribbon mics, so there's a lot of air. And those are the kinds of things that, I am a fan of immediacy in my mixes and recordings, but dimension. So,
well, a record that you did that, I'm guessing included a lot of these things that also has a lot of dimension to it is Van Halen, a different kind of truth. Are some of these things you're talking about with the guitars and, the LCR panning, adding depth, the treatment of the drums, were those some of the things you used on recording that album?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with Van Halen, because on one of your questions, I forget what because you sent out this thing on one of your questions. But there, the I think it might have been an aha moment, or a moment of success.
Yeah.
One of the biggest successes of the Van Halen, and not to change the subject, was actually just getting it done. Like, with those guys, actually finishing something and having it being released was the biggest success for me of that record. I feel like it could sound better. I mean, there's a lot of like woulda, coulda, shoulda things with that. But, one of the things I really enjoyed on that record was getting Eddie to, he used to split his sound with an Eventide harmonizer for years.
Mm-hmm.
Like on the first record, they moved his sound from left to right with a pre-delayed plate, the Don Landy, like guitar dry, left, wet, right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But since there's only one guitar, with Eddie, he doesn't play but one take most of the time. It's a guitar-based drums band. It's not like overdub doubled guitars, because he has so much nuance to every performance. It's not something that's easy to double, because then you have to, when you double guitars, you sort of have to make them somewhat more generic, because you have to take some of the nuance out, or otherwise you get like too much left and right, like two different information. You know what I mean? Like doubling guitars is a very specific thing. And when you don't double guitars and you want the guitars to be wider, one of the things I brought to his party was splitting his mono, signal, the one guitar, into two heads and two cabinets, and having the left and right be a different head and cabinet, and then recording with Royers and 57s and having the low end not come from a ton of EQ on a 57 with an API, but have it be the way that when the Royer is blended in, it gives more low end and dimension and more air, because it's a figure eight. Ribbons are figure eight.
Well, now that's probably 3 times you've mentioned Royer and 57, so maybe we should dig into that combo just a little bit more. If the rock stars are thinking, I've got a 57 and I've been thinking about getting a Royer, what are some mic placements that you might use, typical starting places on an amp, to use that combination and have it sound really cool?
I kind of always go for the same spot and then mildly slide it, but I always put the 57 where the paper meets the dome. That's the magic spot.
Where the paper meets the dome. Sorry.
Yeah. You have to.
Just sounds that sounds like that should be a quote on a wall somewhere.
Well, it's almost sounds like Pink Floyd, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
We don't need no whatever. So the paper, and this is one of the things, like, I love that you like, for you rock stars out there, because that's always been a joke, like,
Right.
But anyway, so for your recording studio rock stars out there, really quickly, if you want to figure out the sound of what's coming out of your amp, you put on a set of headphones and you turn up the mic pretty hot. Get out in front of the amp. Make sure it's not plugged in, so your guitar player doesn't then ultimately turn you into a deaf engineer.
Instant jello.
Yeah, but you basically move a 57 or move a microphone around the speaker, and you'll hear the hiss change. And you'll hear, when you go farther out, farther in, side to side, you'll hear the sound of the hiss change, and you'll hear the tonal nature of the hiss. And I guarantee you'll find the most natural hiss is when you're about 1.5 inches away from where the dome meets the paper. That's the 57 spot. That's like the magical spot. Awesome. Now, if you're too bright, you move a little farther out away from the dome, and But when I'm using 2 microphones, they have to be coincident and in phase. And I only really point you to the videos I've done, because it explains this really clearly. And I did this for Royer. We did a bunch of videos, and they live on the internet. But basically, you want the diaphragm of the 57 to be in line with the ribbon. And I put the ribbon right up on the dome, because I want the brightest possible spot to be the ribbon, because the ribbon's the darker, more mid-rangey sound and more bottom end. And then the 57 wants to be right where that most magical spot is for the 57. And then I blend the two of them like EQ. Like, I don't add EQ. It's a blend. If I want more brightness, I blend more 57. If I want more bottom. And so in showing Eddie that in the studio, he just fell in love with the Royer. And at the time, we got him some of the tube 122Vs, which are the tube ribbons. But the 121s, which are their flagship model, are just great on guitars, and is basically my go-to with a 57 all the time. But I blend those to one track, and then I'll take some other mic like an 87 or 67, or I'm generally not a stereo mic on guitars because I generally don't want a stereo room. I want a mono room to play with because I don't want to try, but
right.
If you like,
because the dry signal might be panned to one side and the room pans to the other. So why would you need the stereo?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of the guitar thing, for me. And so bringing that to the table with Van Halen was something very, it was definitely something that I brought to him, and he's really into, and really digs.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I want to say back to you what I'm hearing too. So Rockstars, I think one of the coolest tips that Ross just shared with us is not even necessarily the 57 and the Royer and the placement, but is this simple concept that says, put on a pair of headphones and turn the mic pre up and just move it around so you can hear what it's doing. And don't have anybody play guitar so you don't blow your head up, but you're just hearing that tone. And I think what's really cool about that and encouraging is that you're steering people towards trusting their ears too, which is really such an important thing to learn how to do. Just like as you record, what you like, and the methods like that allow you to sort of get to the right answer in a way that you can trust what you're hearing, I think are really inspiring.
Totally. I mean, that's your if you were going to ask me, well, what's your most important studio tool that you have? It's not even a tool, it's your ears. Like you have to trust your ears. And that's kind of like going all the way back to like the beginning of the conversation. The one thing that I did have when I sat down in the chair for the first time to actually get some sound out of the speakers, I knew that it was like some intuitive thing that I knew I had to have confidence. Like this was a moment where if I was going to lack confidence and bring a nervous, lack of confidence, like person to that chair, then I wasn't going to stay in that chair very long.
Yeah.
So the thing that I trusted already was I knew what I liked to hear come out of the speakers. Now, how I was going to get it there, I had no clue.
I feel that way every day.
But you do have to trust that thing that you can call it vision, you can call it, whatever you want to call it. But if you don't trust your ears to deliver that, that's sometimes, I actually have to get up out of the chair now, and walk away and clear my head and come back, because there are times when I feel like, for you out there in audio land, take your hand right now and put it right up on your nose. Like take the palm of your hand and put it right up on your nose and shove it right up on your nose. And then say to someone, man, if I only knew where my hand was right now, I'd be in really good shape. And, when you get to that place where your hand is like right in front of your face and you're like, damn, if I could only find my hand right now, I'd be really good. This mix would be great. You got to get up out of the chair and walk away. And then get yourself, and so sometimes when you get to that place, where you just like, you've wound yourself into this, rabbit hole. But for the most part, if you really trust your ears, you'll find your way, to the other side of actually making something sound like music, which is one of my terms. It's like when someone says, hey, is the mix done? It's when I can close my eyes and it sounds like music. It doesn't
That's great, man. What a great quote. I love that. Okay, I got another question for you about Alex's drums on that record, or just, any record where you want to talk about this. But you talked about not using far away room mics, but definitely using ambient mics. What are some things that, like, let's say, do you always go into a studio where you're like, I absolutely know this room is the perfect room for drums? Or do you sometimes go in, you don't know how it's going to be, and then you've got some ways to move the ambient mics around and find that just right balance for drums?
I'll tell a really quick one. And this goes back to, this will be like, moving a time capsule back and forth. I was just at Berklee School of Music a week ago or 2 weeks ago for a week teaching production, which what they do is they have me in their studios and we record different groups, for the classroom. We have to be set up and out the door in 4 hours. And so in one of the rooms, it's really dry and it's really good for like dry sounds and, like very little ambience. But one of the afternoons I had to record this Latin like rock band, like full on, like, really, really like kind of, almost like a Dixie Dregs meets like vocals or something.
Nice.
It's obviously Berkeley, so there's a lot of notes, but really cool, really cool band. And here's a room I don't record in, but I'd been in there once or twice already doing some stuff, knowing how dry it is. One of the things I did was I took 57s, which are actually one of my favorite microphones, and I shoved them all the way up in the ceiling, up in the corners, to just get reflection, like, to get what wasn't direct was like a second reflection.
So they're pointed away from the drums toward the corners?
Yeah, just you look around the room and you go, okay, well, that corner looks like that's going to sound good. And I just put 4 mics up in 4 corners of the room and just was like, okay, we're just going to hear what these sound like. And you push the faders up and, 2 out of 4 were like really good. And then 1 was kind of okay. And then 1 was like super low endy. And I just put that in the center and created like this kind of interesting, really it takes the cymbals out of play a lot and it's all, and you don't know what you're going to get up there. And that actually, one of the good things of trying stuff like in anywhere you do, you'll get a new tool in your tool belt that you may not use for a long time until you need it. And this was something that back in the day at Rumbo Studios, which was the studio that I was the staff chief engineer in early on. It's a studio where Mike Klink came in and did Guns N' Roses' Appetite and some other Guns. And I did Motley there. And then we took that design for John Mellencamp's Belmont Mall as far as a control room. But the live room at Rumbo was one of the best like rock drum rooms. And like its magic, like placement was taking like a pair of 57s, or sometimes I think Mike actually liked 451s because he liked the condenser, a little more gain and stuff, but you'd shove them up in the corners of the room. And that drum sound for him on Appetite is primarily, the room sound is not direct. Like it had a really good direct sound with like 87s or something, 67s in front of the kit for a nice shape on the drums. But the actual like, sort of that Led Zepp type of ambience that you get when the mic is not pointed at the drums. Yeah. And so I do that often when I go into a room where I know that any direct mic is just going to sound kind of dry. I'll just start shoving mics up in the corners and like find like what corners are giving me something, Now,
what if a room is a little bit too live? Is there a sort of a reverse approach to tighten up the drum sound?
Yeah, a really great live like detoxifier is you take some like if they have a gobo that's like not the tall gobos, but like those mid-sized gobos that are about like chest high or waist high, place them in front of the kit and then put some 87s down low in front, and it'll dry up the room, but give you, again, sort of a non-reflective sound. And then the other thing you always do is you can take gobos, put them around the drums and create a tent and put cover the drums with packing, like go over the top with maybe lay another gobo on top and just really close down the kit. One of the great things at United Recorders, which used to be called Ocean Way, or, it was like for years it was called Ocean Way, but originally it was called United because you have United and then United Western, which is East-West now, the 2 famous Bill Putnam rooms. But at United Studio B, you have a canopy that comes down over the top of the drums that's on a mechanical hoist.
Nice.
And you can drop that down over the top of the drums and get a really nice, super punchy, close sound, but then put like M50s or something outside and get a super like really cool ambient sound. So you can, anytime you're in a room that's super like ambient, you want to close down your close mics, because at the very least you want to make sure your close mics don't sound like the fold like the ambience is folding back into the microphone, you know?
Yeah, right. Close enough that you're not hearing the walls too much. Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah. So the walls aren't splattering back into your close mics, because sometimes in a very live room, even though you've got mics close on the drums, the splatter of what's coming all around the drums is getting in all the close mics even. And so you can't even get like your overheads to sound like they're overheads. They don't sound like real mics.
Do you, and if you go into various home studios, you're more likely to run into that kind of thing where walls are just too nearby. Are there some tricks where you just kind of put up like simple panels and hang packing blankets towards the wall and that helps? Or is it hopeless or what?
No, nothing's hopeless. I mean, one of the things you might find in like home studios is that you just go for mono drums. Like you decide, okay, there is no way to get a stereo image that makes sense left and right, because the left side is so much low end and weird stuff happening over here, and the right side is so much weirdness over here, you know, and then your overhead is like, if you have stereo overheads, they're just uneven and there's nothing pretty about them. So just shove like a Coles ribbon, or just one mic over the top, one mic in front, you know, get your close mics and then go for what you're given. And that's why, for me, one of my favorite sayings, because there's a side of me that, you know, goes back to like the fact that I was not raised specifically, I was raised spiritually, but not religiously, you know, so I gravitated more to Zen and Buddhism as a, you know, in my spirituality, because I am a very spiritual person, and I, you know, actually do meditate and pray every day. I just don't live to, you know, my life is not dedicated to Jesus Christ or Yahweh or, you know, whatever, you know. So my more Buddhist Zen mentality when it comes to recording is anything you resist will persist.
Right.
So if you go into a room and you want this really cool, pristine, wonderful, amazing drum sound, but that room isn't going to give it to you, you'll be really disappointed. Your musicians will be bummed out because you won't be able to get them what you want, and your attitude will actually like affect them, because they'll see you bumming out and working really hard to get something you're never going to get.
I feel like there's an analogy there as a guitar player too. If you take an acoustic guitar and you go into different spaces, you go take it into the stairwell one day, you're going to hear that big reverb, and it just makes you sort of easy to instinctively play guitar parts that seem to fit that. And I feel like you're describing the same thing as an engineer from the control room. It's like you put up your mics, that's what it's doing. You know, hopefully you just learn how to instinctively go there.
Well, that's my tendency, and I've worked with guys that don't do that, that drive musicians crazy, that take a week on a drum sound, and by that point in time, the band is completely lost anything called momentum, or their spirit, their soul has been sucked. But the, you know, producer has got me giving him what he wants. It's just now musically maybe not going to be really great, and so in the end, you know, what are we actually doing here? You know, I got to come back to like, what am I actually doing here? Am I doing this to please me really? Or, you know, and it's a balance, because, you know, I have to be willing and ready to alter my perspective. Like at that day in Berkeley, man, I mean, my whole thing was like, I got to deliver a result for these kids and for the band. Like I got to show these kids in this, you know, educational situation, though, that the process is not more important than the result, because we live in a result-based world. Like if I didn't create results, if I couldn't actually finish anything, then you'd have nothing to talk to me about. You know, it'd be like, yeah, we're talking to Ross Hogarth. He sent me, you know, 40 amazing records that you'll never hear because he's never finished any of them. You know, it's like, and everyone's like, what the heck, you know?
Or you didn't want to be teaching that class where you're like, well, if this was a real session, we'd get some good sounds, but we're just going to move on and go with these crappy ones right now.
Well, yeah. So I had to actually get good sounds, but they weren't going to be like in my head, you know, I wanted John Bonham or Led Zeppelin or something, but it's like, now you're going to have to like kind of, pardon me, but pull out of your ass something that you're going to, you know, still be able to use, you know? And so part of it is the use of your tools, and a good carpenter never blames his hammer, you know, you know.
Well, you know, you bring up John Bonham, the levee breaks. That's the drum sound in the stairwell. I don't know the backstory to it, but I'm going to guess that they didn't go into the studio saying, we're going to get this kind of drum sound and we're going to need a stairwell for it. They may have just moved the drums into the stairs, gone, oh, that sounds cool, and play it like this, you know, and they did what you're talking about, which is just arrive at a sound that sounded great for that space.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the backstory. I do know that, you know, that is, even though Eddie Kramer was in the truck, Andy Johns, that's his thing. You know, that was like an Bayer M160 or something hanging in there. Mm-hmm. You know, for all you know, like, you know, Andy like walked up the stairwell to smoke a joint and heard the drums and it sounded amazing and whatever. I don't know.
Let's hope.
You know, but I mean, that is really what happens often. Like, I mean, really, I have a buddy of mine who's got a drum room, and you know, you got to walk past the drums where the bathroom is off the side of the drum room. And I was in there, you know, literally just, you know, taking a piss, and he was playing drums. And I was like, damn, this sounds killer in here. We got to throw a mic in here. Now, permanently, he has a mic in the bathroom, you know, and it's like, that's how chambers got created. You know, people basically pump sound into bathrooms, into places where there's tile and it bounces around. And so you have to be willing to just try stuff often, because the best like things come from just sometimes not using your most, you know, traditional type of technique.
Yeah. And I'll respond to that and share an anecdote. One of the first sessions I did in my studio, I sort of had my way of doing the drums, and this band came in, and the drummer's playing, and the singer, guitar player in the band, he's walking around the room, and he's done 4-track stuff, and he's listening, and he comes and grabs me and says, hey man, the drums are sounding really good up here. And instead of me going like, well, I'm not going to put a mic there. I've got my spot for it. I was just like, all right, let's try it, you know? And so we ended up setting up, you know, the Coles 4038 was on the third step down of the spiral staircase going up to the loft. You know, it was like this very specific spot, but he was absolutely right. He just used his ears, and it was inspiring to hear the low end right there. And it ended up being a great room mic, ambient mic for the drums.
Hey, super quick on that. Quickie story. You know, the studio I was talking about, Rumbo Studio B, which doesn't exist anymore. Unfortunately, Rumbo is gone. It was like, it's now become like, it's really sad because that studio was so amazing.
And was that a MCI console, a 500 or something? I thought I heard that story.
No, Rumbo had originally one room. It was built by the captain in Tennille. And so the first room, Studio A, had this nautical hold captain thing. And that had a 8068 that's now, it went to Canada, and now that's been at Sunset Sound for quite a few years. That's where I just made Rita Coolidge's, and I work a lot in that room. So that console is like my original console. So it went to Canada and then came back when Daryl, who's the captain, made one of his fatal mistakes in studio ownership. He got rid of the awesome Neve for the Neve V that when it came out, because he was convinced by people that he needed this new console, and that was the worst thing he ever did, was buy that crappy V. Wasn't even a V. I never liked those consoles. But in Studio B, which was the second room, which was the Caribou Ranch design room, which was where, you know, Clink did Guns and I did Motley, and, you know, tons of records. Brendan O'Brien did like Stone Temple Pilots and a whole bunch, Jackal, and a ton of records done. But Wilburys were also done in between the two studios, Tango in the Night. I mean, you can go on and on and on. That was a Trident 80 series. And then in the back where Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne built the third room, that was another 80 series Trident.
So Appetite for Destruction was a Trident 80B or an 80 series?
So was Scarecrow, Lonesome Jubilee, Big Daddy. Every record after Scarecrow on for Mellencamp, 80B. Yeah.
Groovy. I feel like I can hear that sound. I love the sound of those boards. A very hard hitting rock and roll sound.
Oh yeah, and very transparent too in its own way. It's just really almost straight wire. When you take when you change the chips to better chips in there, it really opens up. That was something we did on both consoles. So anyway, so we're in Mellencamp studio getting the drum sounds originally when we built the studio for Scarecrow, because that was John did in like a chicken shack outside of Seymour where he grew up, but then wanted his own studio outside of Bloomington, and that's where he's had Belmont Mall ever since. And so we were working on drums and getting drums together for the Scarecrow record, and basically we had 57s, because that's what you do. You just gang up a bunch of 57s on one channel for talkback mics. So I had a bunch of 57s out in the room, pointing away from the kid, obviously, around where everyone was standing and stuff. And then, the band goes out and plays basically a take, and we're sitting there, and, Don Gaiman, and we're just like going, wow, that sounds great. And the band comes in the room. Long story short, those 57s weren't going to tape, and a majority of the drum sound that I was hearing wasn't actually the room's mics, but it were all the talkback mics open. And so when you pushed play on the tape, you weren't hearing those talkback mics anymore because it wasn't coming through them live. And this sound that was prior when the band was playing was like killing.
Yeah.
Now, not killing anymore. And, I'm looking around the room going, wow, what's broken? Something's not playing back. And then it took a few minutes to realize that what I was hearing were the talkback mics, which then led to like, oh, crap, we got to get an extra track going because these have to be printed.
Yeah.
Because that was the thing, we did back in the day and still do. You just gang up all the talkback mics to one channel and slap a compressor on it so that, and that's kind of the SSL story of, Hugh Pagham in what's the studio in England where he did like, Phil Collins, where the talkback mic on the SSL, the listen back mic drum sound, because when he hit that auto talkback, and it opened up to the listen mic, and now it's slamming through there. It's like, what the heck is that? We got to print that.
So that's kind of like the Phil Collins. Oh goodness, what's the song I'm thinking of with the big drum fill?
In the air.
Yeah, into the yeah.
All those drums became, all the Hugh Pagham, all those big drums became. That was the whole thing. It was like the listen back mic in the SSL became. Like they took it and put it into a box, and
that's great.
And that became like, we're printing our drums through this, because once you heard it through that, it was like, oh my God, we got to find a way to get that to tape.
That's so cool. Well, hey, let's pause for a sec, and we'll come back in for the jam session. Rockstars, before we take a break, a reminder that you can find links to all the stuff we're talking about here with Ross in the show notes. Just look on your mobile device and you can click right through, or go to rsrockstars.com and then just search for Ross Hogarth, and it'll take you right to the blog post. And then also, if you're interested in learning more about some of the basics of mixing, I do have a free mix tutorial that will show you how to mix in any DAW just using some of the free plugins, and you can find that at mixmasterbundle.com. We'll see you in just a moment for the jam session. Roswell Pro Audio brings you microphone design that is out of this world. Endorsed by a growing list of artists and producers like Phil Colvin of Def Leppard, Ross Hogarth, who's recorded Van Halen, Ziggy Marley, and the Doobie Brothers, and Super Dupes, working with Drake, Mary J. Blige, and Eminem. These are all rock stars that have discovered just how great Roswell microphones sound. Check out the Mini K47, which uses a capsule modeled on the one in the vintage U47 at a street price of only $299, or the beautiful Delphos condenser microphone with a capsule tuned like the vintage U67 with great clarity and far lower noise at a street price of only $899. In fact, you are hearing my voice right now on the beautiful Delphos microphone. These mics are carefully crafted by hand and immediately feel good even before you plug them in and hear how great they sound. These are well-built microphones that will last you and your studio a lifetime of great recording. Check out more audio examples of these awesome mics at roswellproaudio.com. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Ross Hogarth, joining us from California. Ross, are you ready to jam?
Yeah, man, let's jam.
As usual, I've still got many questions I want to ask you about various records and things. But off mic, we were talking for a moment about, the importance of doing what you want to do with your time in the studio and making records. And, I guess I would describe it as sort of coming to terms with your why, and for me, I've realized recently that my why is I'd like to spend all day in the studio making music with friends. That's what I've sort of boiled it down to. And you had a great quote you wanted to share.
Well, yeah, I mean, because, we were talking off mic, and it goes to two things, Lidge, which one is at the beginning of your introduction, you were on your sheet that you gave me, you asked for an inspirational quote. And both of these things I'm going to say, both are part of what we're talking about. The first is just to say what you were saying about being around people that you want to be around and making music with people that that is, I had just said to you, I mean, I've at the point in my life where I want to be around people where we're celebrated, not tolerated.
Nice.
And that leads back to like one of the things about like passion, and it's the concept of choose a job you love and you never work a day in your life. And,
nice.
And so for me, that's kind of where it is. I do this because I love it. And when I'm not doing it with people that I enjoy being with, I start to question why I am doing it then, because now we're just tolerating each other. And man, it's like, why? That's just not, it's not worth it, man.
And when you talk about choose a job you love because you'll never work a day in your life, the flip side is a reminder that be careful what you choose because you're probably going to get it.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when goes to like, I could talk a lot about this, but in very quickly, I'll just say that, first of all, like success, is not an event, it's a journey. So, getting somewhere is like, there is no real there. It's like, it's all the journey. And so if you're really loving what you're doing, you're going to love the journey, and you're not going to be that much focused on like honestly, like winning a Grammy. I don't think any Grammy will really make someone with low self-esteem feel better about themselves. It's just, no amount of things will make you feel better about yourself. You can, buy the fanciest car, but if you still think you're, a piece of shit, you're not going to really appreciate it. So one of the things for me in my life has never been like things. It's always been like really understanding that the people that I'm around and the energy they bring to my life is way more important than the amount of stuff. And, that's the great thing about this business, is that there are some of the greatest people, some of the greatest.
There they are reaching out to you right now.
Actually, yeah. But there's some of the greatest people, it's such an embarrassment of riches that I'm part of, it's really great.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask you about. So actually for quite a while now, I've been giving you a shout out in one of my sponsor ads for Roswell Pro Audio. You were mentioned as one of the people who, had nice things to say about them. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about any of their mics, or if I could ask you about the Delphos and the Mini K47. Are these mics that you've used yourself and really found useful on your sessions at all?
Yeah, absolutely. The Mini K47s are and have become one of my absolute go-to room mics on drums because of they don't have a super hyped top end. A lot of more modern and I say lesser expensive microphones, not meaning lesser quality, but just lesser expensive, have a very shrill, brittle top end. And, not to disparage China, but I mean, again, this is not I'm disparaging a country, but Chinese capsules, inexpensive Chinese capsules, and poor choices of transformers, you tend to have inexpensive microphones that are bright and have like the wrong frequencies for drums. Because, you know, when someone's hitting cymbals, the last thing you want is like an accentuation in, you know, like 4 to 10K or somewhere in there. You know, you want nice open microphones, but the thing about the Roswells, you know, and this is like really like the truth. Sunset Sound's one of my most favorite places to record, and I'm always playing around with mics in the room, 67s, and one of my more favorite and most favorite are the Mojave 200, because they're a lot like 67s, except they're very matched and even. So I'm playing around with room mics, and my engineer there, the staff engineer, who's one of my best friends, Jeff Neal, he and I are always playing around with mics. We're like, what are we going to put up today? Oh, let's put up C37s. Let's put up these, you know. So when I first got the Roswells, I'm like, here, let's throw these up. Let's hear these. And we push them up, and we both look at each other and are like, wow, that really sounds like the room. Like, it's really good. Isn't that like we both, can those little mics be that good? You know, so they have become very much go-to microphones on things like drum room, Kunga's percussion. I don't really use them on vocals because I am spoiled. I have one Delphos. I don't have a pair, but the Delphos, is a little bit more high-endy.
Yeah.
I mean, a little more, but something about those K47s, man, it's just perfect for a lot of B3, a lot of different things, that I'm not using.
And I find the K47s also do have a little bit of a mid presence, which makes them really sort of mix themselves nicely.
Yeah, it's not a bright presence. It's a mid presence. It's sort of like got a nice sort of like forward in the part of the mix that's not like all the way up and all the way down.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, thanks for mentioning that. So let me jump in with a couple more questions about some different records. You have worked with Dweezil Zappa. I would love to hear some stories about working with Dweezil. I have been a big Frank Zappa fan since the very beginning. In fact, I've said this on the podcast, but one of my nightmares I remember having was me trying out for Frank Zappa's band and then breaking my high E string and just trying to get my shit together, and I couldn't. So I didn't make the cut. But I'm also a huge Zappa fan, and I have been friends with Dweezil. One of my closest friends, a guy who I have been making music with for most of his career, is a guitar player named Blues Saraceno. And Blues has known Dweezil since they were both young. Dweezil's a little bit older than Blues, but they bonded as shredders back when they were both, like Blues had moved out here from New York when he was like a teenager. He was in a band with like Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, and he was like, he was just he's a guitar shredder, but he's also a really great composer and writes music for TV for the last bunch of years. Anyway, I've known Dweezil through Blues, and we've been all friends, but I never worked on his music until I got involved on this Via Samata record a few years ago. And basically, Dweezil was casting people to mix his record. And ultimately, I got cast to mix the majority of it just by virtue of our friendship. And one of the things that he really liked about working with me was, I think I just respected him so much that a lot of guys don't want the artist like to sit down and, change things in a mix. But Dweezil is a crazy great engineer. Mm-hmm. And, like his dad, he's just, a full spectrum musician. Not only, hands down, one of the finest musicians on the planet. No two ways about it. He goes out and he plays Frank's music. Frank was and will one day be, I think, honored as a Stravinsky or Tchaikovsky of our day as a composer. And one of the things that really bothered Frank, even though we don't know it, but Dweezil knew it, was that he wrote music like to the page, but then he had these musicians that would like interpret it, and he always kind of wanted it played the way it was written. Like if you had, Stravinsky, no one would then jam on Stravinsky if you put Stravinsky's music in front of them. So. Well, no, I read Frank's autobiography, and I remember him talking about the frustrations of working with professional classical musicians in an orchestra, and how happy he was when the Fairlight showed up.
So Dweezil now goes and plays Frank's music to the note. And that's a whole nother aside, but yeah, it was really great working with him. It was so much fun, and also very challenging because he pushed and pushes for sounds that he hears in his head and he wants them to come out of the speakers. And so that was really great. And it was also great turning him on to some of my favorite gear that he's building, and he hasn't yet completely finished it, but he's outfitting his studio. And I introduced him to Phil Moore of Retro Instruments, and he bought stay levels and 176s, and I introduced him to Jeff Turzo of Overstayer.
Jeff's great too.
And so he bought Overstayer gear, and so yeah, it's really fun with Dweezil. And I just, again, very complex arrangements with a lot of sounds. And having to fit that all into a stereo spectrum is always a challenge, and it was a really good challenge. There's a song that I really like that we did called Funky 15 that he went over to London to Abbey Road and had Jeff Emmerich record the strings for him on that one and come back with it. So
cool. What do you remember any really unusual guitar recording setups from that record?
Dweezil likes to use the fractal. And so Dweezil is programming his fractal, but it's not recorded digitally because it's coming out of his power amp and speakers, So, but he's way into like totally tweezing his stuff through the fractal, and then he gets to take the exact sound on the road.
Yeah.
And so he spends a lot of time, designing and being a tone merchant.
A tone merchant. Interesting. I like that idea. All right. Well, let me keep jumping to some other stuff that you've done. Speaking of strings, you mentioned Dweezil recording strings, and there was another record you did for the last Shadow Puppets that had some really cool strings on it. And I wondered if that was something you had recorded on the album, and if you wanted to just talk about anything you've learned about the best way to record strings for those. Maybe for the rest of us, maybe it's that rare occasion that we're recording strings and we need a little bit of some good tips.
Well, yeah, I was brought in on that to record all the strings. My friend Eric Gorfain has they're called the section quartet, but this was not a quartet. This was a big section, but Eric worked with the string arranger on all the arrangements, really complex, wonderful string arrangements. And for me, the recording of strings really comes down to the room, because it's interesting how a really good room will make me look really good when I record strings. And so one of the rooms here in LA, which is one of the best rooms ever made, is a room I do record in a lot. And it's the United Studio B, where more recently I did drums and stuff for the Derek Smalls record. Sorry, my thing keeps dinging. Yeah, so on the Shadow Puppets, we went into United, and one of the things that United has are M50s, which are God's microphone created for strings. It's the Omni. Neumann, and those capsules just have the absolute perfect reach for strings. So I always put up a pair of M50s when I have them. The other microphone that, if you don't have the M50s, that will really talk like an M50 is the Sanken. I think it's called the 100K or whatever. It's there's a Sanken. I'd have to get the exact model.
Is this like a measurement frequency response kind of mic?
No, the B&K, it's called the 100K. The Sanken is the first 100K microphone designed. It's an Omni microphone that literally goes from 20 to 100K frequency response. And so it'll make a crappy room really sound crappy, or a really good room sound amazing. that's the thing about, honestly, to quickly say something about microphone choice, if you're recording a super bright instrument, the last thing you want to do is record a super bright instrument with a super bright microphone in a super bright room.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a really beautiful room and a really nice even microphone that takes a wonderful picture, that's where the Sanken, it's really an amazing microphone. And also, like an M50 will cost you, like, if you can even find one, probably about $40,000 to $50,000 a microphone, where the Sanken, is like $2,500 microphone.
Nice.
So the Sankens I often use up in the room along with the M50s. And then I always put a Royer SF24 or SF24V right over the conductor's head. And that, will capture the whole room, and you blend that. And then you want your spot miking. But one of the things with recording strings is too many spot mics will actually make your strings sound smaller. So you kind of want to pick like one microphone per each four. Like if you got, say you have, say 8 or 10 or 12 or however many first violins, put one mic over each four instead of one mic over each two. And it'll actually make your sound bigger. Than the more microphones in that situation, the smaller your sound gets.
And would the spot mics be cardioid pickup patterns, directional?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then what about these Omni mics that you're, the M50s or the Sankens? Where are they? How far apart and stuff?
Yeah, sorry, Decatree or spaced pair. If you have two of them, but if you can go with Decatree is great, which is, measured triangle,
Mm-hmm.
And or spaced pair, basically sort of measured from the podium so that they're at a distance. And then however high up your ceiling is, not so high that you're just sounding like a wash, but maybe, somewhere between 10 to, somewhere, like for me, I'm a little over 6 feet tall. And when I put my hand fully up, I'm somewhere around not yet 10 feet, so,
Mm-hmm.
I go a little higher than that. And that's usually like kind of perfect. You know what I'm saying? It's like, there's a certain height where you go too high, you're just getting sort of the rosin air and you don't get enough distinction,
Yeah,
so.
and this is on the, I guess if you're on a sound stage, there's no stage with audience, but it's not so far back that you'd be in a seat if you were an audience watching the string section. It's closer than that. It's more within the proximity of where the conductor is standing or a little behind the conductor.
Yeah, it's just kind of behind and off, like, so, I mean, a Decatree setup can use either, 3 or 5 Omni microphones. There's 3 arranged in a T pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's you can then go and put sides too, you know what I mean? Where it's like on the edge of the, which would be like the edge of the orchestra. But I don't really normally use a 5 mic Deca. I use the 3 Omnis, and that just really, and this comes from Deca recordings. I mean, right. I think it's the original, the Deca engineer, from Decca Records.
Well, that's cool. It's just a reminder, Rockstars, for us to do a little more research on Decatrees and that kind of recording, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to be learned from the sort of deep level of knowledge that they arrived at from doing the orchestral recordings.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, for me, I really, I have worked really hard in my career to cover my bases and not just be, I love doing rock and I love being a rock engineer that just throws mics up in the corners of the room and this and that. But I also like being like somewhat of a classic recordist. When I get hired by a rock band then to record their strings, I'm being hired because they know that I'm going to give them an actual legit string recording.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also going to print the strings through the chamber and the plate at United, so they walk away with this very classic recording of their strings that they can morph and modify and, change. But the actual recording is the best recording I can personally give them, with the best microphones of choice for the music. I really pride myself on, not going in and, just giving them like, oh, well, I think just it should be just like a degraded, weird little, Chamberlain or Mellotron sound. No, these are real strings. I gotta, and then you can take them and you can make them all lo-fi and messed up if you want. So sometimes I will print like a weird lo-fi microphone so they have that, so that like that I'll add like my little thing to taste. But the thing I hate is like when I get a strings or drums or anything recorded that should sound good and then have something maybe sound broken, all I get is the broken sound, and I can't do anything with it,
Yeah.
So,
all right, cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was reminding me of Portishead. I think when they sort of had their second or third album, I remember hearing a story about them going into the studio and doing a string session, and they probably did something along the lines of what you did, which is they also recorded it straight to cassette so that they could resample it and do cool stuff with it. All right, well, let me ask you a question about Rita Coolidge is an artist that you've been working with recently, I believe. Do you want to share any stories about working with her and what that record was all about?
I mean, this is the most recent release as a production. I had a record come out on the same day last week of a band I mixed, but Rita was a real serious labor of love, a project that took the course of about 2.5 years from start to finish. And in really there's a lot to say about it, but she had lost her sister to a murder homicide where her sister's husband had killed her sister and then killed himself. That was in 2014. Yeah, that was in 2014. And so when we met in 2015, she was, really still in the depth of grieving that. Her sister was really very important part of her life. They had bands together, and Priscilla, who was her sister, had been married to to Booker T, and the two of them had gone through life a lot together and stuff. So it was really a heavy thing. At the same time, my brother had just gotten cancer, and so over the course of the next 2+ years, he went through cancer, went into remission, came back, and then died in the course of making the record. So the record is dedicated to her sister and to my brother, which is very deep. And so the choice of the songs and everything. So long story short, going into this record, I was very focused on making the record she never made when she was in Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. Rita Coolidge, for those of you who don't know, sang with Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. And Delaney and Bonnie were considered really kind of the best American rock band at the time. And then that band that was Delaney's band went on to become the band for Layla, for Derek and the Dominoes, for All Things Must Pass. And then, prior to that, Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour with Joe Cocker. So Rita sang as the backup singer and, one of the singers in that band. She sang on Dave Mason's Alone Together. She sang on All Things Must Pass. She sang on all these records. But by the time she went to making her own records, this kick-ass American like rock blues thing had already morphed itself into sort of middle of the road, adult music. And then she married Chris Christopherson, and then they made like country MOR. And so she never made this kick-ass record that I wanted to make, which was like my favorite music, like basically, Alone Together or, Leon Russell. She's called Delta Lady. The song Delta Lady is about her. So long story short, I went into making this record with that kind of intention to make a kick-ass record on a 70-year-old woman, and one that was a record of spirituality and empowerment and love. And that was my vision, and I feel like I succeeded. And also, had to go through some of the toughest times of my life, and sit in front of the speakers and try to mix a record while I was grieving the loss of my brother and dealing with all of that. So,
I'm so sorry to hear that. I that must have been incredibly tough. And a couple of thoughts is I felt like I can hear a real emotional depth to the tone of her voice on that record. And then I wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts you want to share about what it means to go through real emotional, life-changing experiences and what that does to your creative energies and abilities. And I mean, I remember when I lost my father when I was 27, I was young, he was young. And I came back from a week for the memorial service and hit the studio, and there was this unexpected creative explosion going on in me, and I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that kind of, those life experiences and what that can mean for creativity.
Well, first of all, I think in the big picture, for anybody, and I think we all, anyone that is alive, the sine wave is actually our life. Things go up, things go down. You are only dead when there's like a straight line. So, honestly, if life is just a straight line, there really is no life. So for me, all swings of the sine wave of cycle of life, are the things we have to accept. And, so for me, anytime there's been pain or really deep pain, I find that that's a learning, like it opens me up to a deeper learning experience that I'm being opened up to have to accept or not. I can either be a victim or not. And so as far as adversity, I really feel that, and pain, I feel like pain is a really important stepping stone or touchstone to deeper spiritual growth. So if I'm willing to accept that this is one of the things that Gov't Mule and I have always said to each other is that we kind of kid and we go, life's just perfect the way it is. And I may not be happy about it today.
Yeah.
So I do feel that there's no such thing as a problem, without the gift for you that it's being offered. And so what this offered me was to try to make a record that expresses there is a bittersweet thing inside of this record, but the two of us made it with the intent that on the other side of it, people will be empowered on some level by it. And so I really had that intention all the way through, but I do have to admit that, I was in the midst of trying to get it finished, as far as recording, as my brother was getting worse and worse, and we knew we were going to lose him. And then he died right when I was supposed to start mixing it. And I had to just basically say to the label and have Rita's support in this, that I couldn't actually work until I was ready to work. So I actually was kind to myself, which is the thing that we tend not to be. When things are really painful, we then continue to beat ourselves up. Mm-hmm. And if I had tried to continue to mix this record, the mixes that I would open up when I was trying, because I don't believe there's trying, there's just doing or not doing, sounded like crap. That was me in my head about it. I ended up pulling everything down to zero when I actually started over. Mm-hmm. And pushing them all back up, because the recording was my recording. So I knew it was in there, but I had gotten so caught up in my sadness of the loss of him. And then the feeling of I got to get this done, and, kicking myself in the ass about it, that when I pulled it down and pushed it back up, it became effortless again. And I mixed this record. It was really cathartic, and I was able to put joy back into it so that, the music felt the way I wanted it to feel. But I had to stop to do that and have the support of a record label and an artist that allowed me to do that, knowing that there was a better result than just taking the record away and going, so they pushed back release. Everything was the way it was supposed to be. Record came out on her birthday week last week. Everyone seems to be digging it. I got my friend Gov't Mule to play and sing on it and write with her. And I'm very, very proud of this record. I really am. And, who knows whether it sells 5 copies or not. I'm not about that. But I do feel very much like this was exactly what I intended going in, and coming out the other side. I would never have written for my brother to die or anything, but everything happens for a reason, I guess,
Yeah.
God has a plan, and I don't know what it is often. And then God, doesn't give me more than I can handle. And sometimes I wish he didn't trust me so much. So,
Well, those are deep insights. And I just imagine it. My heart goes out to you, man. That must've been really tough to go through.
and I think it's in there. I think it's in the music. I know it is. I know that I know it's in there. And I think people have been feeling it. It's been getting, people are feeling connected to this record by this, older woman that seems to be, resonating. So that's,
yeah. Well, let me talk about, take it into a slightly different place and talk about capturing feeling on a record. Ivan Neville, Dumpster Funk was another album you did, I believe. And I wondered what you wanted to say about that process, or what you learned about capturing groove in the studio.
Ivan is I've known him a long time. Neville Brothers, Ivan, that music is like, man, it's just one of my favorite things to work on. And I can't wait to work on another record. And, all I can say about Dumpster Funk is they got the funk in the trunk. It's like, you got Tony, they got two bass players, and it's just, and you got Ian, the nephew, playing guitar. They're just some badass, they're some badass cats. And it's just that's music that just, I could mix that. I can record and mix that all day long.
Yeah,
honestly.
that's something I imagine is all about feeling it when you're mixing it. Like you literally feel the groove and have a sense that you're doing the right thing just by how it moves you.
Yeah, that's, again, this all goes back to like my most favorite music, which again, I want to just keep focusing on working on records that I feel I'm, then this is not, there's no ego in me talking about it like this. It's like, if I really don't feel like I'm the right guy to do it, I probably shouldn't be doing it. But there's music that, if I really feel I'm the right guy to do it, it's almost like the money doesn't really matter at that point. It matters, but it doesn't really matter, because one way or another, if there's, I've figured out how to live without the wolf staring in my window at me, so to speak. Yeah, because again, I don't,
No, you're not talking about our friend Russell Wolf, are you?
No. Yeah, right. That's a funny image, right? That's like, now you need, like, if we were on screen, you'd need like a picture of Russell with his face pushed up against the window. Like, oh my God, there's Russell Wolf looking in the window.
So Rockstars, Russell Wolf was a guest early on the podcast. So go listen to his episode, which was in the teens or the tens or something like that. He's just a great guy, hilarious dude too.
But work on, for the young people out there, you all want to work on, everything that you can work on when you're kind of getting into it. And when you say no to something, sometimes no is just like a full sentence. You don't need a whole bunch of reasons to say no. You just don't feel it, and, no doesn't mean that you suck or someone else sucks or whatever. But what no does is give you the space to say yes to something. So when you say yes to something, the worst thing you can do is wish you said no, have it take the place of something you really want to be working on. But now either you're going to bail on it and you're going to become like known as like a flaky person, or you do which is the right thing to do, which is you stay inside a yes. But you said yes when you really should have said no. And you should have said no knowing that there was someone else better for that project, and something's going to come along that you want to do that once you say yes, you don't have the space to say yes to that other thing.
Yeah.
Or now you're trying to do more and bite off more than you can chew. So I've kind of learned in my life that when I say no, it usually means that something better is going to come along that I say yes to, because that's the space that I've created, for it to fill. So
do you have a process that helps you determine whether it's a yes or a no when you're not 100% certain right off the bat, when it's not obvious?
Okay, super quick. This is my advice. Often I don't give advice because sometimes advice is like, an unsolicited advice becomes criticism, but right. You ask for it. my advice on this is my own advice. And depending how long you have to make the decision, say you have a really important decision to make and you have to make it in a day or 2 days or whatever. So before you've told anybody of the decision, you go inside yourself and get committed 100% to like the yes or whatever it is. Like, yes, I'm going to take that. Or yes, I'm going to get married. Or yes, I'm going to buy this car or whatever. Inside yourself, you'll feel a feeling that you'll feel it in your gut. It's not cerebral, but you just feel a certain way about it. And then make the other decision. Now, you're not told anybody, so you don't have to change your mind or go back on it or, be held accountable. You know what I'm saying? Then you make the other decision. Make the no, I'm not going to do it, whatever. Oh, that's not the right car. I'm not going to get married or whatever it is. I'm not going to take that house. I'm not going to rent that thing. I'm not going to take that job. And so the no, and you'll feel a certain way in your gut. It'll feel a certain way. And one way or another is the right decision. You'll know because this is like a line out of a movie, but it's like when there's doubt, there's no doubt. Because when there's doubt, that's not the right decision.
Right. Good point, man. So, what a great answer to my question, too.
Yeah. So you make the one decision and you live with it and hold on to it and you're 100% committed, but you haven't actually done anything. You're just living with it inside you. And then make the other decision and live with it inside you. One of those two decisions is the right one because it'll feel a certain way. One will feel like you're carrying a bag of rocks and you don't know why. And the other will feel like not so many rocks in the bag or a little lighter or whatever. Yeah.
So it's like mixed choices. You try this way and then try that way and then go listen to it outside of the studio back to back and see which one you like better.
Yeah, because once again, it only comes out of the speakers. You close your eyes, you push play. How's it make you feel?
Right, and you haven't emailed it to the label yet. You're making this internal first.
Oh yeah, I mean totally. I got an acronym for that. Which is like the word is wait. You just wait and you go, what am I thinking? Either why am I texting? It's like when you're going to send that text, which is like, someone pisses you off or whatever, and you're ready to push send on that text that's going to blow up your whole thing. And you just look at it and you go, why am I texting? Wait. You just pause for a second. What am I thinking? And if it's the right thing to do, then you send it and you drop that bomb. But if it's not, you just delete it.
That's great, man. That's great advice. Well, so now we've been going a long time. Do you think I had one more question I would ask you about studio stuff, if you think we're good for that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, groovy. So this is sort of, I want to talk about vocals for a sec. You've worked with a lot of great artists. The Doobie Brothers, they've got strong voices. Actually, Edgar Winter, Ziggy Marley, lots of people, but Sick Puppies, particularly, I think it was the song I Hate You. It's got a real combination of breathy, full voice tone and scream vocals. And that's a lot of different vocal styles all in one song. And I wondered if you could teach us some ways to get the vocal level right and treatment right in a mix when you've got a variety of different places that the vocals are going to.
Well, the first thing is, you want to record them on, and it's funny because Shim of the Sick Puppies, he's actually playing his first solo show tonight. And one of the little dings that I got was him hitting me up, telling me, you got to come see me because I've worked on all of his music as the Sick Puppies. And Shim does have, quite a diverse, dynamic in his voice. And one of the microphones that's great on him for the screamy stuff that's usually great on a lot of screamy singers that we all tend to use on screamy singers, the SM7 doesn't have a lot of 3 dimensions when it comes to breaths and verses and sensual tones, like a 67, a 47, any of your favorite, nice condenser mics. So I often will use, I'll have 2 mics set up, and if you're trying to get a whole performance, then I'll have the SM7 right next to the condenser, so I'm recording to 2 tracks, and that way, like on Cold Chamber, I did that with Dez and Devil Driver. And then if you don't need to do it as performances, you set up your verse, your whole chain for the more open and nuanced, and then you have your second chain for the screamy stuff, and then like when you go to mix, then often what I'll do even is I'll pull down to multiple tracks for different EQs and different, because I'm a very much a parallel compression, parallel EQ, multiple, like if you looked at my vocal like mixing, often there's even if it's on the same mic, like Rita Coolidge or something, I'll have a slightly different compression and EQ and chain for her in the verse to the chorus, so that, so I create the audio dynamic, or the audio, like the separation of sections, like a scene, like a director or whatever in a movie is changing, or cinematographer, or whatever analogy you like, because it's very important for me, particularly on a lot of kinds of music, to create different scenes and different audio scenes. So I'll chop out the audio and drop it down to separate tracks, and do different kinds of distortion. Sometimes some double and triple vocals with, different like bullet mics and things like that, to create a more dynamic, like space of just, instead of just distorting the one track, I'll have distortion wrapped around the one track, which isn't really that distorted. Saturation is a great thing. I'm not, I don't use like a ton of like decapitator or those kinds of things. Often I use actual transformers that are wired. And so this is my mixing thing. I'm a very hybrid mixer. I'm not just an in-the-box mixer. I've never been able to just mix in the box, even though I love the box. So I do have transformers wired from 200 down to 50 ohms that blow up naturally. And that sound that we like in Decapitator or the other plugins that kind of do it, but kind of make things sound more fuzzy to me than they need to be. I do that sometimes externally. And then I'm a big foot pedal guy. I like using Jonathan Little has a box called the PCP, called Professional Cheesy Professional. Like, a way of going out of Pro Tools into a foot pedal and then back into Pro Tools with the right impedance.
Yeah.
And I use a lot of guitar pedals in my mixes, where I actually print like your, whatever ZVEX pedals or whatever, and those will show up on those kinds of heavy metal songs and things like that. Not particularly on like super organic stuff like Kepmo or anything, but when I'm doing like rock and hyper, like, hyper audio.
Yeah, where the voice has to join a bunch of processed guitars or whatever. Yeah,
it has to cut through, a bunch of grindy guitars. A good track for that is a track that I'm really a fan of what I did on a song called Rowboat by Coal Chamber, where the guitars are massive, but the voice is also really twisted. So,
okay. Well, I've put together a YouTube playlist of a bunch of the records you've worked on from your discography. And of course, we'll include links, what you were talking about, and what you sent me in the show notes as well. But Rockstars, I try to make it easy for you to just click through and go listen to some of these records we're talking about as they get mentioned. What a great answer to that question. Thank you for sharing all that. That was an awesome answer.
Oh, well,
I like that idea of double miking stuff, and I've run into that so many times, and I know what it feels like to be thinking, oh, I should turn up the mic pre a little more in the verse, and then it hits the chorus, and you're like, oh, no, I should really back it down. And your answer is one that reminds of us to just say, why don't you just do both? Why don't you just have the right thing for each section of the song and just manage it as you're listening back. So I guess when you're listening to the vocals getting tracked, maybe you just find a balance or a sweet spot, or you mute but from one to the other so that you're hearing the verse vocal versus the chorus vocal when it happens.
Yeah, when I know that it's in phase, like when I know the two of them aren't phasing each other out, I'll just create a balance of the two together. And if someone comes in and really wants a playback, then I'll just mute the 47 on the grind and open it up, or whatever mic I'm using. Corby, I think on Shim it was a Corby mic that Tracy Corby had built back when he had these convertible capsules. And
the Corby mics are wonderful. In fact, I'm working on a track right now that was all the vocals were done on the Corby mics, the blue or the red or something like that.
Yeah, I have one. I have two of his. I have one of his convertible setups, and then I have just one with like a 67. Tracy There's a really, he's an amazing mic guy. Kind of has taken a little bit of time off, I think, but he really has made some great mics and done some work on my mics. He used to work for Stephen Paul, so we know each other back in the day when Stephen Paul was still alive. And yeah, I mean, your tools. You gotta use your tools. Don't be afraid of trying some stuff and using stuff and being, just no fear. Just kind of, I think that's one of the things I learned from being on the road and working on the road. And just it's like my motto has always been whatever works. It's like, if I don't live inside of whatever works, then I get too stuck with like, and I said this earlier, like if I continually try to do what I did on the last record and think it's going to work, I'll probably miss something that I could do that would work better, or, just be like stuck trying to get the same sound on every record. It doesn't work that way. And that's one of the reasons I like working on so many different styles of music. It pushes me, just always pushing me to like get out of my way and like get in the groove.
Yeah. And I was mentioning before, having an artist come in and suggest something, another record, the label owner, sort of vaguish producer of the session came in and told me about some other way of doing the vocals that it could have so easily been interpreted as, dude, I'll take care of it. You should just maybe keep your opinion to yourself. But it turned out to be the greatest thing ever. Like I took the input knob of the 1176 and jacked it all the way up with an SM7. And it's one of my favorite vocal sounds now, but I don't know if I would have arrived at that on my own. It seems way too wrong to do.
Well, I'm going to give two quick little tips before we sign off. They're not even tips, but the first of which is, inside of that is like, and this will lead to the next thing. The first is, when you're in the studio, no matter who you're with, and particularly when you're with younger bands, the thing that will totally suck all the air out of a session is the word no, and then a long explanation why. So when like someone says, hey, how about we try? And then they say something, and then, the wizened, know-it-all engineer goes, well, no, and then explains why, and it goes on for 15 minutes, and then an argument ensues and back and forth, and 45 minutes later, everyone's sort of like pissed off at each other. You could have taken like probably 10 minutes and given that a try and listened to it out of the speakers. And either it would have been like, probably it didn't work, or maybe it could have been the greatest idea. But the thing that is going to be what proves whether it works or not isn't your explanation of no and then why. It's going to be more like, yeah, okay, let's give it a try. And then your job as the producer engineer is finding a way to not disassemble the whole guitar setup or whatever it is you got going, and to give that a try. So if it does work, but it will work then better with a different, like now more complete, like technique, you already know you're on the path to something better than if you didn't try it at all. And if you don't try it at all and you just say no, then the resentment amongst the band of you being that kind of person that's not willing to listen to them is going to infect your session for the rest of the project and will just get worse, which leads me to my main thing here about the music business. People coming up in the music business as engineers tend to either be all about the music, which is like the technical and the music and everything, or more about the business, and then it's about the money and if they're making enough money and all that stuff. And for me, if you forget that the music business isn't really about music or business, it's really about the people you're working with and how you're going to interact with those people. And then you have your music skill, your business skill, but it's all connected back to your people skills. If you got shitty people skills, it doesn't matter how good an engineer you are or how good a businessman you are. If you're in the studio with crappy people skills, then it's not about either. It's just not going to go well. So often when people say, about the music business and what's your best advice about the music business? I usually say it's not about music or business, it's about people. And the more you can actually assess and do an inventory on what's going on with the people that you're working with, the more chance you have of, having better music and better business all connected.
I think that's great, man. Thank you for sharing that advice. And I'm thinking that you made sure we got to cover a couple of the points in the actual jam session questions, which I never asked. So thanks for doing that. Shall we jump to the final question and bid goodbye to the rock stars?
Yeah, awesome.
All right. So this one's hypothetical. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you're going to go back and find young Ross slinging a guitar in East Village. And, I don't know if you're smoking a joint on the top of the stairwell with Glyn Johns or not, but you go back and tap yourself on the shoulder and give yourself some advice. And young Ross says, "What are you doing here?" And you say, "Well, I've come to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day." Maybe that's the advice you just gave us, but is there anything you'd like to go back and tell yourself at the beginning of this long journey?
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting question because I try to take my own advice. I have a friend of mine who, he died of throat cancer in 2009, but he was a singer-songwriter named Stephen Bruton, who wrote some of the most amazing lyrics and stuff. And he was one of my best friends. And one of the things he always said was, when you trade hope for regret, that's when you grow old. So you can't have any regrets. You just can't. I mean, we just do what we do in life, and you look back and you hopefully learn, you try not to go back over territory that you said you weren't going to go back over. But one of the things I did do in my life was I probably I might have stayed in certain situations a little longer, because I'm a pretty stoic, stick to it guy, which has always served me, and showing up has always served me, because I believe that you got to show up. Mm-hmm. And 99% of the gig has been showing up. But going back into that thing of where you stick to something a little longer than you should before moving on. There have been times in my life where I might have stuck around a little longer than I needed to be, and might have missed a couple of things that I look back on and go, wow, if I hadn't done that, then that. But you don't get to live in the rearview mirror. Mm-hmm. So you just continually have to, every once in a while, take a look back and then keep moving forward. So I try to live without regret, but I also try to make sure that I don't make the same mistakes again and again. Because that is where, you just, if you don't make those, if you don't learn from yourself and don't learn yourself. So, it's that's an interesting thing, because I look back on those times in my life back then, and I was definitely the product of a divorce, and maybe, there was a side of me that was a bit of an angry kid from New York that came out to California. But I was really fortunate in that, because then I was surrounded with so much love of people that weren't my immediate family, that I learned that you could have family that wasn't biological and really love them like family. And I'm very fortunate in that respect. Mm-hmm. Because I could have probably continued to be some kind of angry kid from New York. The angry punker. So I guess it goes back to, what I was saying about people. It's impossible to know people until you know yourself.
Yeah, true.
The sooner you can kind of figure out what makes you tick and who you are, and look at some baggage you're carrying around that you're doing the same shit again and again. You kind of go, I need to drop this baggage because I need to, So, I'm pretty content in having lived the life that I've lived. And I have a lot of the same friends in my life that I've had for my whole adult life. They just don't happen to be the ones I grew up with for the most part, Yeah. Because I got away from where I needed to get out of, because I needed to get out of New York. It was a great place to grow up. My whole upbringing, everything is a piece of who I am. but I'm very fortunate to live the life I live. So I live in an attitude of gratitude. I really do, Lidge. I really do. My attitude, change your attitude. You can change your life on any given day, you know?
That's so true. You know, I find I'm running into that all the time. And, you know, some terrible thing will happen. I'll start to get pissed and I'll just pause for a second and go, what would it be like if I just didn't get pissed about this? And then it's like, oh.
I always say my mind's a bad neighborhood if I go there alone, you know? So I make sure I got friends, people I can call, hang out with, make music with people that are friends and family, like you said, you know, have a 2-hour discussion with someone like you, which grounds me back into like going on with the rest of my day inside of all this stuff we talked about, which is, you know, a lot of who I am and reaffirms. That's why I love teaching. I love going to schools and teaching kids. I love being surrounded by that energy of excitement and excitement in life. It's all about what makes. So I'm pretty, you know, I haven't done everything I wanted to do in my life. I've done a lot of things I know are, you know, considered success, or this Grammy or that, records that will hold up hopefully over the test of time. And I just want to keep doing it, you know, and then at some point, you know, continue to do some other stuff. You know?
That's great. That's great. Well, Ross, thank you so much for being here on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. What you just said is what this is all about. So this is like a safe place to just be able to talk about making great records, and Rockstars, you're all included. We're all in this together. So thank you for listening as well. Ross, let the rock stars know how they can find you and follow you and learn more about you and your music.
I have my Twitter and my Instagram, which I try to do stuff. I'm not particularly, it's Boogie Motel, BOOGIEMOTEL, which is an homage to my past, which was the first studio I worked in was Boogie Hotel on Long Island that Foghat owned. Nice. A tech named Bobby Tees and his son, who works for Derek Trucks, Bobby Tees Jr. Bobby was out there and he worked up in then Woodstock. But Boogie Motel at Twitter or Instagram. And then my website is my bit of tongue-in-cheek. My production company, when I created it back in the 80s, was Hoax, Hoax, Hoax Productions, which I always thought that Productions was a bit of a hoax, because it really is like, how do you record a great band or produce a great record if the band isn't good? It kind of have to be a hoax at that point. So, right. And my last name is Hogarth, so in New York growing up was always like Hoagie or Hoax. Now with our president as it is, it's a little different, because the word hoax has been out there a lot as like things that are not real, but that's not what it is. But it's kind of just my own like tongue in cheek. So Hoax Productions is my website where you got my discography. And if you want to hit me up and contact me and, you know, tell me that I'm wrong about something, I'm happy to listen.
That's great. That's where I learn all my best stuff in the studios, when somebody says I'm wrong about something, and then I learn a new way to do it. Groovy. Well, thank you again for joining us, Ross. Rockstars, a reminder that we will have links to all the stuff we're talking about in the show notes on your mobile device. Just click through. If you're online, just go to rsrockstars.com and search for Ross Hogarth, and there's the blog post. There'll be a YouTube playlist in there too, so we can listen to some of the records and some of the links. And then, just a little plug here too. If you're getting into some mixing yourself and you just want some free mix training, you can go take my course at mixmasterbundle.com. And in fact, if you're really interested in learning some more stuff about drum recording, you can also go to rockstarsofdrums.com and check those out. Ross, thanks so much for being here on the show with us, man. I really look forward to meeting in person, and we are eternally grateful for you taking out so much time out of your day before you start mixing or doing whatever you're doing today.
Yeah, no worries. I'm looking forward to meeting you too, and I really enjoyed the conversation, and my best to everything that everyone's doing. And I will thank Mark Rubel again for making the connection. Mark at Blackbird Academy is one of my dearest friends, and I believe in what they're doing over there. And John and
Mark is awesome.
So, all right, Lidge, you guys all have a good day out there in radio world and rockstar world.
Dig it, man. That's right.
Okay.
Hey, we're all rock stars too.
That's it. I never considered myself one. So
here you go. This is a moment to shine. All right. Thanks, Ross.
Okay. Peace out.
Cheers.
Right on. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.